Hello YouTube. This time I'd like to take you through the fuel system in the gasser, and I'd like to demonstrate it for you. So let's talk about the pieces. This is a Holley carburetor that's been reworked. It's a 750. It's the fuel delivery system for this vehicle. A Holley wants between 5.5 and 7.5 psi fuel pressure. Fuel pressures between carburetors vary. For example, Edelbrock wants 6.5 max. A Demon wants 5 to 6. Autolite wants 4.5 to 6.5. So Holley comes in on the high side. So we're going to tune this thing into about 6.5 pounds. The next part of the system are the hoses. These are cloth braided AAN hoses throughout the whole system. The fittings are also 8AN. Next we have the fuel bypass pressure regulator. That's a mouthful. What that means is that this unit regulates the pressure to the carburetor, and we can read that on the gauge. So this is a regulator, but bypass means is that you can adjust this regulator to the pressure that you want, and everything else is bypassed back to the fuel pump. And what that does is allow you to run a fuel system without deadheading the fuel. Deadheading fuel would be connecting this right to the carburetor, and the pump is going to work against that carburetor and have no relief. Whereas we have the fuel coming from the pump and any excess pressure being returned to the pump. It has the second benefit of keeping the fuel cool. As I have no trunk to mount the fuel cell in, what I'm going to do is run my pressure hose and my return hose through 20 feet of hose to simulate running from front to back of the car to this stand I have here on the workbench. Now what we have here on the workbench is, and what we're looking at, is the fuel pump and the fuel filter. And from there we go to the fuel cell. So what I have is a fuel cell. The fuel cell is connected to the fuel filter by an 8N hose. It goes to the sump on the tank. Normally the sump would face the rear of the car, so when you take off on the line, all the gas goes to the back. And normally you would have the return line hooked to the second fitting in the sump. Now why would you do that? You would do that so that you don't introduce air into the system. By that I mean, I have fuel coming back into the tank and it's pouring into the tank, creating turbulence and air bubbles. If I introduce it to the bottom of the tank, then it can't introduce any air bubbles because the system has been flushed. So let's put some gas in here and test it. That should be enough. We have here on this side is the vent for the tank, and inside the tank on this fitting is the rollover valve. We'll connect up the electric pump. Check for leaks. What we want to do is turn the adjustment nut on the regulator till we get 6.5 pounds on the dial. So we just turn this down, and you can see the needle going up. And we want to get to 6.5, and we'll lock it in place. In case you don't believe this is returning fuel, there you go. So I'll just pump the whole system dry, and then I can store it for when it goes into the car. This is just a quick demonstration on how I put these hoses together. I did a number of them on the project and developed a process that I think worked pretty well. And the very first step in that process is to get a square cut on this hose. That's the most important thing and the most important step in the process. You can use an air cutoff wheel, but the problem with an air cutoff wheel is, even with a new cutoff wheel, with the hose laid across the motor, the wheel will only cut through half of the hose squarely. So you got to make two cuts. Now it can be done, and I've done it, and that's the way most people will do it. But I have a shear, so that's what I'm going to use. Take some electrical tape and cut it off nice and square and sharp. Don't pull break it, so you got a nice even end, and wrap it around the hose where you want to cut it. You're going to cut this tape in half, and what you're doing is trying to prevent fraying. So put this tape on as tight as you can and only go about a wrap and a half. Here you have the hose wrapped in the tape. Now I've only got a wrap and a half on here, and it's nice and tight. You can actually see the texture of the hose through the tape, and we're ready to cut it. We take the wrap tape and put it in the shear halfway across the tape, because we're only going to cut this tape in half, trying to keep the fraying to an end. And we just cut it. Now this thing doesn't cut the thread very well, so what I do is then take a pair of scissors and just cut the thread. And now what you want to do is give a little haircut to any cloth that is sticking out. Here we have everything I think is needed to put this fitting on that hose. We have an 8N wrench, we have an owl, we have some oil, some antifreeze, a flashlight, and something to wipe your hands on. So the first step is to take the tape off the end of the hose very gently. You don't want to disturb the cloth. And then we disassemble the fitting. And put it on the end of the hose. Now what you got to do is be careful to get all the braid inside the fitting. And what you want to do is get it pushed on until that nice square end that you cut in the end of the hose is pushed up against the seat of the fine thread that's inside the fitting. And this is where the flashlight comes into play. You use it to look down the fitting to see that hose is straight up against those threads for the next nut. Wrap your fitting with tape so you don't mar it in the vise. You can buy a soft jaws vise for these things, but if you wrap it with tape, that works too. And put it in the vise. And you want it so that the end is flush with the end of your vise. And just snug it up. You don't want to get crazy with it. The next thing I do is I oil up this owl. And I take it and I put it down my fitting here and sort of twist it at the same time, oiling up the inside of the hose in preparation for the rest of the fitting. What it's really doing is pushing the hose out against the nut. And we're done with the owl. That's what I need the owl for. Now, to prepare the fitting, I take a little anti-seize and spread it on the threads. Now, theoretically, you don't need it, because aluminum won't gouge aluminum, but it makes it easier to thread it in. And then I put a little oil on the cone there that's going to go inside the hose and thread it inside the hose. Get your AN wrench and put it on the inner nut and hold the hose so that you know that it's not backing out, and tighten until you have about a fingernail's width between the nut and the hose connection, and then turn it so that the flares line up. So this flare lines up with this flare, and that way it looks nice. And you still have a nice free moving hose connection. And now you can take it out of the vise and take the hose off. Then we have a scratch-free fitting, hopefully leak-free also. That brings us to the end of the video. Keep watching, there'll be more.